Hello, happy Earth Day. I'm Jen DeRosa, Program Coordinator for Energy and Environmental Programs at Johns Hopkins University. And on behalf of the Earth Day Planning Committee, which includes Dr. Jerry Burgess, Dr. Sarah Chacon, Phyllis Hecht, Dr. Kathy Wagner-Hill, Dr. Dan Zachary, and myself, we would like to welcome you to our special Earth Day 2021 event on living environmentalism. 51 years ago, the first Earth Day demonstrations began. Metaphorically speaking, the Earth Day seed was planted on April 22nd, 1970, with US Senator Gaylord Nelson and EarthDay.org founder Dennis Hayes doing the sowing. The catalyst, environmental atrocities witnessed with the 1969 Santa Barbara oil spill that cruelly killed thousands of seabirds and marine mammals within a close stretch of the California coast, and the ignition of oil slick debris on the Cuyahoga River in Ohio, also in 1969. Fertilizing this Earth Day seed and allowing it to grow strong roots was Rachel Carson's previously published book, Silent Spring, making the argument that humans can have a formidable negative impact on the environment and showing the world that pesticides like DDT persist in the environment, in the soil, in the water, and in the body long after their original purpose is past. Earth Day is a day of activism for the environmental movement. And through the years, the living entity that is Earth Day grew. On the first Earth Day in 1970, 20 million Americans demonstrated for environmental protections. And today, 192 countries and about 1 billion people around the world are participating in Earth Day. So we've grown from a seedling to an ecosystem. Now, before I introduce our panel for today, I want to first tell our viewers that are logging in from all over the world to watch our seminar about an opportunity that the Earth Day Committee would like to share with you. We are holding a raffle for the next hour that will close during our question and answer portion of today's seminar. And it's in the spirit of Earth Day. We're going to be raffling two $60 gift certificates to the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, Bird Academy. And they have courses that are taught by ornithologists on bird watching, bird photography, even bird sketching. So just to name a few, the list goes on. So my colleague is entering the link into the chat, or will be very soon. And if you would like to be entered into our raffle, please click on that raffle link so you can enter your name and email. And we will be announcing the two winners at the very end of our event today. And with that, I would now like to introduce our Living Environmentalism panel. Our panel moderator today is Dr. Jerry Burgess. Jerry is the director of the Master of Science in Environmental Sciences and Policy, as well as the Geographic Information Systems Master's and Certificate programs at Johns Hopkins University. His research interests are highly interdisciplinary, utilizing the disciplines of biology, ecology, and geology, and soil science to explore community dynamics and invasive ecology in urban, rural, and forested landscapes. Dr. Rebecca Aicher is the project director at the Center for Scientific Evidence in Public Issues for the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Rebecca has worked on policy-relevant scientific research on topics related to invasive species, restoration of ecosystems, climate change, and water resources. Dr. Jairo Garcia is the CEO of Urban Climate Nexus. He's also adjunct faculty for the Master of Science in Energy Policy and Climate program here at Johns Hopkins University. An expert in urban sustainability, climate change, and sustainability education, Jairo develops innovative policies and education programs to make communities and cities more sustainable, more resilient, and more equitable. As the former climate policy director with the City of Atlanta, Jairo develops the first citywide Atlanta Sustainability Report, Climate Action Plan, and Climate Vulnerability Assessment. Dr. Doria Gordon is the lead senior scientist in the Office of the Chief Scientist at Environmental Defense Fund with a focus on ecosystems. Prior to joining the Environmental Defense Fund, Doria spent 25 years working in science, conservation, and management for the Nature Conservancy. Her current research focuses on the scale and measurement of net carbon sequestration in natural and agricultural systems. Mr. Julian Goresco is the Director of Sustainability at Johns Hopkins University and has over 10 years experience working in sustainability and higher education sectors. Julian is responsible for helping to lead our university's sustainability vision and working with stakeholders across the entire university to identify practices and programs that advance Johns Hopkins' role as a leader in sustainability. Dr. Emlyn Koster is a geologist and museologist, working at the helm of Alberta's Royal Tyrrell Museum of Paleontology, the Ontario Science Centre in Toronto, the Liberty Science Centre next to Manhattan, and the North Carolina Museum of Natural Science. With a transdisciplinary approach that views nature and culture as interdependent, Emlyn's research is focused on the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is the term for this time in Earth's history to emphasize humans' disruption of the Earth system. And last but definitely not least, please also welcome Miss Sarah Solomon. She's a graduate of the Johns Hopkins University Master of Science in Environmental Sciences and Policy program. Sarah works for the American Association for the Advancement of Science in the Center for Scientific Evidence in Public Issues. Previously, Sarah served as a contractor for the US EPA's Office of Research and Development. She has experience in policy-related research on climate change, water quality and monitoring, and environmental education and justice. So please use the chat to welcome our very talented and knowledgeable panel. Since it is a virtual program and we can't hear your applause to welcome them, please use the chat to give a virtual welcome to our panelists as we begin today's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. DeRosa, and happy Earth Day, everyone. Happy Earth Day. So I'm incredibly pleased to be here with this esteemed panel. If you listened well to Dr. DeRosa, they have a really broad background and a wide range of experiences. And given our theme for this seminar of living environmentalism, I would like to start our discussions with a question about how environmentalism has evolved since those first days. In many ways, much of the modern environmental movement has roots going all the way back to the Transcendentalist and Romantic movement, and then evolved up through the Progressive era and onward. And that first Earth Day that Dr. DeRosa spoke about in 1970, a lot of that was focused on classic pollution and overconsumption. But we have different focal points now, as evidenced by President Biden's commitments and participation in the climate conference today. So my first couple of questions to our panel, they are related, but I think they're going to be helpful for laying a foundation. So I'm going to start with my first question, and I'll begin with Doria for that one. Doria, how have the kind of pressing environmental issues of the late 60s, the early 70s, how have those issues how are they fundamentally different between what we're dealing with today in the 21st century, or are they the same?
Thanks, Jerry. And I would just say I appreciate being invited to be a part of this panel and to be able to spend this Earth Day with all of you. Thanks. I would actually go a little bit further back in time. So when we think about how environmentalism evolved, and you referred to a number of pieces, I like to think about the turn of the early 20th century. Think Theodore Roosevelt, the starting of National Park Service and US Forest Service. We were protecting land and water, right? That's really where the focus of environmentalism was. And it was very much about for people's use of that environment. And there was a big multi-use component, right? For recreation, for hunting, for forestry, for a variety of different types of uses. As we moved into the 60s and toward the 60s, we became aware that just putting great big fences around big blocks of property, which were wonderful and gave us all, and still give us all huge pleasure, I think. The best place for me to spend Earth Day is in one of those big blocks of property. We realized that pollution was starting to degrade even those remote places, so that we were having acid rain, we were having a number of water pollution, air pollution, and people were noticing that this was not just in their backyards, but further away, but it was very much also a place and contaminant or species level kind of concern. So LA had terrible smog problems, and that turned into a big focus on air pollution. We had rivers catching on fire, as Dr. DeRosa talked about, and that led us thinking about our water quality and what industry was dumping into our waters. People started to get upset. The government decided it was appropriate to try and regulate releases of pollutants and to help with cleanup of pollutants. And it became very much a role of government to be regulatory, and then a role of the civil society to use the legal system, lawsuits, if they felt that the laws were not being upheld, right? So Environmental Defense Fund, who I work for, was started in 1967 over the fight against DDT, and won the first local banning of DDT because of impacts on raptors, right? Bald eagles, ospreys, and the like. So we became very much around, you know, this can't happen in my backyard. It was place-based, it was fairly focused, but it was also watching that leakage into our natural systems that had been protected by the previous generation. Now, of course, we're in a whole different game, because there is no way to look at the world and not think that our environmental problems aren't global. And obviously the poster child for this, and so exciting that today we have the administration and many other countries focused on this issue, is climate change. So what we see now is that we have that humans now have the potential to alter the course of life on every place of every species on this climate. That means that we have to transform governments and economies. We have to work at very large scales, and we have to work cooperatively across the globe to try and address a bunch of these problems. So I think that there's been a huge evolution since the first Earth Day, Jerry. I also think that we have more tools in our hands to address some of these problems. So big innovations, technological innovations and the like. You know, we're using many more market-based solutions. We're working with the private sector. It's not just government against the private sector, which was the rebellion against this big government and regulatory approach. And we need to really think about the application of all these approaches in a much overdue way, thinking about local communities, local cultures, environmental justice and equity issues. So that's a big piece, I think, also of environmentalism in the 21st century.
Wow, that's great. Talk about laying a good foundation. Really, really good job there, Doria. And you said a couple of things, you know, about time that made me think of Emlyn, because we all know geologists tend to look at time in a slightly different way than others. And Emlyn, I wonder if you had any thoughts from your slightly different background about, you know, this evolution of the Earth Day and in the environmental movement.
Jerry, good afternoon. Thank you. And I am delighted to also participate. I too, like Doria, would like to start the timeline that I think is centrally relevant to Earth Day thinking back a bit. Not maybe as far as Doria did, but let me go back to 1948. That is when the British astronomer, Fred Hoyle, pronounced that he felt that once a photograph of the Earth from the outside had been taken, that new ideas as important as any in history would be let loose. That's almost a quote of his remark. It wouldn't become known, and it's still not widely known, unfortunately, because I think it was a very prescient statement. Of course, his prediction came true. He could not know that it would be 21 years before NASA's Apollo missions would give us those iconic photographs of our isolated blue-green orb under a swirling set of white clouds in which life really wasn't even apparent to the astronauts. So I think that's a timeline that really set us in motion, and it makes us appreciate that if NASA had not made a journey to the moon to look back at the planet, we may not have come very far at all, in that view was instrumental in widening our horizon. The next thing I'd say, Jerry, is that I think while it's called Earth Day, not to play on words, but we really need to think about an Earth system. The Earth is made up of a series of interdependent, interacting shells. Maybe climate change makes us think centrally about the atmosphere and the lower atmosphere, but it's not just about cooling the atmosphere back 2 degrees. We need to realize that the calamitous outcomes of climate change is a worldwide rise in sea level, an obligatory relocation of people that live in low-lying coasts to higher ground, and there are many other repercussions. So from the atmosphere, we come down maybe next to the hydrosphere, the shell of oceans, rivers, lakes, with a reminder that oceans cover 3/4 of the Earth's surface, and then down into the cryosphere, the frozen sphere, the ice sheets, the glaciers, and the tundra, all of which are being greatly harmed by the disruptive impacts of humanity, receding ice sheets, receding glaciers, and the melting of the tundra, releasing carbon dioxide. And then we come down to the biosphere, which of course straddles the lower atmosphere and even into the crust of the Earth. But maybe the most important subset of the biosphere, in which we're affecting an unprecedented, unnatural extinction of all non-human things. We humans, all 7 billion of us, going to 8-9 billion, are sort of exacting a terrible toll on all of these interacting, encircling shells to the planet, in which we realize they're all sort of interdependent. And so we come to maybe even the COVID-19 pandemic, where we realize after a year of knowledge that we have a pretty good handle on what it is and how it impacts us. But we really have got to grasp that it may replicate itself and other pandemics in the virosphere, that subset of the biosphere which contains viral diseases, that's subject to us kind of mucking around with ecosystems, which Doria emphasized, because the more we upset the balance of nature, the more we're going to expedite zoonotic diseases and the transfer of deadly diseases, which may reach pandemic proportions from one species to another, whether it's other animals to humans or humans to other animals. Right now in zoos, you may have heard that we're having to treat higher animals, primates, for COVID because we're giving it to them. And so this is a whole linkage, which I think in the 21st century going forward, when we think about Earth Day and we think about it every day, we've really got to think about the human impact on all those interacting shells that encircle the planet, right down to the lithosphere, and the fact that we're increasing seismicity by pumping in hydraulic fracturing, and we're putting nuclear waste and pumping it into supposedly safe chambers underneath the surface of the Earth. And we're mucking around with aquifers and the quality of groundwater. So the whole system needs to be looked at as a coherent, integrated whole.
there were a couple of themes that I've already heard from you folks, and this idea of systems is one, and the idea of the Earth being in trouble, the rise of activism, developing policy and legislation, and it makes me now start to turn to my a second question that I wanted to ask, and Rebecca, I think I'm going to pose it to you. I'm going to toss it your way next, and it's because of your work in science communication, which has changed over time, and literacy and scientific evidence and public issues. So, as a communicator, I'm going to throw a hot question your way. But as a communicator, how did we go from seeming environmental consensus and bipartisan cooperation 50 years ago, fighting pollution, to what we now have as a fiercely partisan situation that would seem to be inconsistent with the systems holistic approach that Doria and Emlyn would want us to consider. So how has the seat of power in environmental policy changed? How do we keep it moving forward? And as a scientist, how have scientists' involvement in this environmental movement or environmentalism changed over the past, 1970 Earth Day to today?
Yeah, so lots of great ideas and questions in there. And as Doria and Emlyn have said, thanks so much for inviting me and having me a part of this conversation. I think a big part of the role of scientists is really what we call engagement, and that's a dialogue. And so when you are sharing your knowledge, you're also taking opportunities to learn from other people. And so it's not a one-way communication where a scientist is the expert and whomever they're speaking with is to listen and learn, but really an opportunity for scientists, community members, policymakers to share their perspectives, to listen and grow from there. And I think that there is a fair amount of agreement when people start to do that. So when you talk with local decision makers about issues that are happening in their communities, a lot of the partisan pieces fall to the side, and it's about finding solutions and helping community members and helping folks that are important and need scientists and policymakers and everyone kind of working together. I think also that scientists over time have come to see that they have different roles and responsibilities, that there's opportunities for them to get involved in discussions, for them to share and advocate for solutions that they understand will work from a scientific perspective, but also that policymakers have tough jobs because it's not always just about the science. There are other aspects that influence how people make decisions, values, costs, morals. All these different pieces can really play into how we address problems with scientific solutions.
No, that's great. So I just want to follow up with that. And any of the panelists can answer this, not just Rebecca. So she talked a bit about solutions and scientists looking to be part of that solution process. So we've come a long way since the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, and yet we still have unprecedented issues and challenges. Some would use the word apocalyptic challenges ahead of us. So what are, if we can think of the arc of time, this history here, what are some significant areas of progress, real progress that we've seen in the past few decades? And that's for any of the panelists.
May I just throw in that I think we need to treat the challenges we face as if we were trying to bring about the use of seatbelts or stop secondhand smoking. Scientists alone can't do this. We've got to engage sociologists and psychologists. We need major marketing firms in order to sort of help science get across its message, which, left to their own devices, and I'm one, I would have to say, let's be retrospectively critical that scientists have not always considered the communication of their science to the public to be much of a priority. And they were satisfied for a long time with rather simplistic science literacy questions, pass, fail. Did dinosaurs coincide with earliest humans? You know, does the sun revolve around the earth or vice versa? We need science to educate psychology and sociology to have the public understand that what we now need to know is not those kinds of answers to those kind of questions, but much more the nuanced science and society question that is much more complicated and which involves all of us. It's not an option to be interested in science literacy. We all have to have a lifelong interest in the literacy that we all need to have in the Earth system.
Thank you, Emmeline. I think that's absolutely critical what you said about making sure that we all, in some way, we all pull our fair share, right? Not just the scientists, but the entire body politic or citizens of the planet. I still want to go back a little bit and hit this history part a little bit. I'm looking for areas where we've actually moved forward on the environmental front over the past years. We talk a lot about battling, but what are some areas of progress that we've seen? Jairo, Julian, both of you have been involved in different aspects for quite a long time. What areas of progress do you see us engaged in?
I would say that obviously to look at the areas of progress, we had to look at the problems. Look at the problems. For decades, since I was a kid, I was in high school, epidemiologists have been talking about diseases. We knew that the destruction, as Dr. Koster mentioned, we knew that the destruction of the environment and the abuse of the natural world, especially in the conditions that we are putting the animals that we consume every day. I knew since I was a kid that was caused a huge pandemic. We knew about that, and since all my life, that I'm kind of old now, all my life, very little progress has been done on that in the name of things that can be changeable. Like for instance, culture. Culture can be changed. There is this tribe in Papua New Guinea that used to eat the brain of the ancestors, and that could use what we know now that was a mad cow disease. Should we, in the name of culture, let them doing the practice? Cultures change. It's something that we change. We are not the same. So why we have to sacrifice humanity in the name of culture? Well, we can change culture in a way that it can be respectful from ancestors, but adaptable with the advances of science, specifically science. So we ignored the science for decades and decades and decades. There is this article that was published in 2018 that specifically talks about climate change and pandemics. And it was published in Science. It was just a scientific paper and totally ignored. And 2 years later, we had the pandemic. So we had the pandemic, and it's totally related what's happening with climate change. For decades and decades and decades, the scientific community is telling us about the risks of climate change, and we're trying to have excuses to address these issues. The economic excuse, how we mobilize people, how we change habits. Those are excuses that is putting us at risk, and the scientific community is clear that if we don't take action, the consequences have been devastating, and we see the devastation year after year. Last year, we remember the fires in Australia, the fires in the West Coast. We see the intense hurricanes. We see all of that. And well, luckily, I'm very pleased. I was listening the climate summit with President Biden this morning, that everybody's talking about what we had to stop talking and was to taking action. So I think we have to learn in order to move the progress. We have done some. We had to accept that any forecast that we did in the early 2000s about the amount of wind energy, the amount of solar energy, every forecast was wrong. We are duplicating. We are, for instance, solar. We have doing 17 times more solar than we used to think that we can do. So we are moving very fast in that direction. But the changes has to be so rapid. The scientific community is clear that we need to change in this decade. It's in this decade that we need to change. That we have to massively change the way we do, the way that we consume, specifically food. We can change. We have the tools. We have the technology. We don't have to invent anything. If there are new acknowledged, if there is a new inventions, it's totally fine. But the most important thing that we need to do is change. And we do have the tools, we do have the technology. It's just a matter to make people conscious that the power of change is possible.
Julian, what do you think? What do you think about that aspect of change? Can we change the culture?
You know, I think we would all recognize it's a tough moment right now to both recognize the critical urgency of the moment we're at when we think about the need for global change and outcomes. And at the same time, when we think locally at the organizational level or at the individual level, there is a lot to celebrate. And the tension comes with how fast can we create the change to fulfill and address the necessary global issues we have. And one of you was touching on this earlier, and I was making a note to myself around just the immense diversity of stakeholder organizations that really need to play a role in climate and environmental stewardship. When we think about, you know, ourselves as individuals, the institutions where we work, the municipalities we live in, you know, through states, countries, and globally. And so I was going to mention renewable energy deployment, which I think is a fantastic example of where there's been significant investment, and we're starting to now see the fruits of that research and labor through scale and investment as a fantastic example of significant progress in the near term. But the scale of our issues are global, and I don't think any of us can accept individual wins or the status quo right now. So there's this constant tension to celebrate successes, to acknowledge them, and to not get complacent at the same time.
Interesting. So, Sarah, I actually want to hear you in a second. And specifically, there are two things that I heard, or two themes I heard with Jairo and Julian that stuck out to me. And one was about this culture of change, and the other one was about the scale of the issues that Julian mentioned. So, Sarah, I want to borrow, I hate to do this, but I want to borrow President Obama's kind of popularization of Dr. King's words about the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, right? It's a common phrase we hear. So last month, President Biden and the White House announced the members of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, right? So I'm getting to this cultural aspect and scale of issues. And that movement by the White House was to fulfill, you know, campaign promises and Vice President Harrison's commitment to dealing with environmental injustices, to ensuring that historically marginalized and polluted and overburdened communities have greater input on federal decisions, right? And in fact, over the past few weeks, we've even seen a call to rename or rebrand Earth Day. I don't know how many of you've seen some of these articles, but there's a bit of a movement in certain sectors to rebrand Earth Day as Environmental Justice Day. And I think it's specifically to deal with some of the issues about culture and scale of issues. So Sarah, there's lots of warm and fuzzy feelings around Earth Day, but many of them feel that it's a little bit been hijacked too warm and fuzzy, and maybe we should consider rebranding in favor of some justice aspect. So as somebody who is out there communicating science and is representing a different generation than I am, how can we be sure that justice and equity around environmental issues are being truly addressed as we move forward?
Thanks for that, Jerry. I think this is a really important point and something that Doria mentioned, but I think is worth further exploration. And that is actually the history of the American conservation movement, which was very much founded by predominantly male, white, urban elites, often displacing people who had lived on ancestral land for generations. And this land was taken for our beautiful national park system and for other conservation areas without respect for those communities. And I think we as environmentalists and as stewards of this planet need to be cognizant of some of the ugliness that is at the core of our movement, and to make sure that as we build this movement, we are being conscious of the intersectionality and the need to include groups of people who represent different perspectives and different cultures. And I think we need to acknowledge that Indigenous rights, women's rights, all of these other groups have so much bearing, all of these other movements have so much bearing on the environmental movement, and one cannot make progress without the other. So I would say that my generation has begun this work. I know generations before me have also taken significant steps. I do not think that we are at the point where we can say we have created this perfect coalition where everyone's interests are perfectly represented. We are certainly doing the hard and the good work to make that so. But unless we acknowledge the sort of ugly place that we have come from, how can we possibly make strides towards a better future for us all? And I would say that it is core to the climate movement that we acknowledge that people around the world, people, communities of color, people living at or below the poverty line will be impacted by climate change disproportionately and differently than those who find themselves in the position to almost be able to buy themselves out of the impacts. And unless we take care of these communities and these people, we cannot hope to, save ourselves or really have a community to pass to our children. And that's a scary proposition, and it's a hard reality to face. But I think that we as individuals, we as scientists, are up to the challenge, and we can take steps where we can, and we can educate others, and it need not actually be as apocalyptic as perhaps some paint it to be.
Jerry, I think there's another slice of this that I suggest needs to be in the baseline of this discussion, and that is that the human impact on the Earth system has been so geologically rapid. Many of us say it's happened in a geological nanosecond, that there was going to be an inevitable lag between us realizing the problem and the problem beginning. And what I'm referring to is it wasn't until 2004, that's half a century almost after we see the planet from a distance from the moon for the first time, that the program called the International Geosphere Biosphere Program, which has morphed into the group called Planet Earth, realized that in hindsight, starting in the mid-20th century, and they charted this in 24 graphs, 12 of them to do with socioeconomic indices and 12 to do with natural system indices, that the Earth had been in it unwittingly on 24 exponential trends, that by the time it was recognized in 2004, it became known as the Great Acceleration. And now we are living the downstream consequence of all those trends having transpired over 54 years before they were noticed and published, and still the world does not really know about this body of research. So many of the damages that we're trying to rectify are already at an irreversible, unsustainable fashion. We can't bring back animals that have gone extinct. We can't cause glaciers and ice sheets to expand. We can't extract the plastic, which is ubiquitous out of every environment. And so there are many other examples, but basically we are playing catch up. And as a geologist and as a humanist and someone who's tried to put this into the museum sphere, I frankly am not optimistic that other than tinkering with mitigating actions, that we're going to be able to do what is required to effectively sort of turn the tide back, no pun intended, on the very extensive multi-factor changes that we've already brought about, most of which are not reversible.
I would like to, obviously, is the position that we had to analyze. Indeed, as a person that works on climate, I can see that point, that sometimes we go one step forward and two steps backwards. But we have to keep up optimism. We have to, because otherwise it's the only way that motivate us. And there are some good examples that I try to always, give to my students and keep in my mind, that in our lifetime, we have seen things that I thought we'd never see. When I was a kid, everybody used to smoke. Everybody was smoking. And I never thought in my mind that we're going to be in a society that smoking was banned. When I was a kid, like, that was impossible. Everybody used to smoke in airplanes. People used to smoke in airplanes. It's like insane, but that was happening. You know, cities like New York and Paris, I saw with my eyes that those cities completely changed. And then, you know, the same environment. I mean, I think somebody mentioned about the air in Los Angeles, Atlanta. You couldn't see the sky here. It was just absolutely horrendous. Now we see the sky is blue. We can swim in the rivers. I had a chance to swim in the Charles River in Boston. That was impossible to swim in the Charles River 50 years ago. It was so contaminated. And now we can swim there. So even though I understand, I see the point, but definitely we can make the change. One of the examples that I can see that I truly believe is amazing. I never thought that when I see the first Black president of the United States, I thought that it would never be impossible. If I can, give $1,000 to somebody, says I would never see that in my life. And we saw that happened. So the thing that I'm trying to point is that although I see Dr. Coster's point, and you have a really, really good points, I sometimes humans surprise us in amazing ways. And I try to put my knowledge and to put my efforts in that car. And even though all the things that happen and how difficult things happen, I want to think that we can make the change that we need. And I truly believe we have to. And the point I always think about is that the problem with climate change, which obviously apparent to the scientific community is one of the threats, the biggest threats of humanity. Even though it's bringing up all the horrible things of humanity, the other side is bringing the best of people, all the scientific community, physicians, people of faith. I give presentations at churches that they are so committed to do this. I see in front of my eyes that change that I truly believe makes me excited, especially young generations like Sarah and all of them. I marched with them before the pandemic, and I see the enthusiasm and I see in their eyes the change. My students, every day I go to my students, I see that enthusiasm. My class climate policy is growing and growing all the time, and more people is that please expand the class because we want to take the class. All those kind of things make me believe that we're going to fix this because we don't have a choice. We don't have a choice.
And still, Jerry, to go back to your point, your question, we have whole communities that are being left behind. So I sit between the two of you, Emlyn and Jairo. I see the enormous threat. I see really incredibly impressive progress, right? And I see that we have communities, as Sarah was talking about, that have been completely left behind, that are still the places where we dump our pollution, where we don't regulate, we don't enforce the regulations that exist, where we don't involve those voices as we make decisions, even about what happens to their communities. Even when we want to improve what happens to their communities, we don't involve their voices. And I think that, Jerry, you started out this little session about environmental justice and equity and how we move forward. And I think those are the two areas we really have to focus on, which Sarah really introduced, which is everybody has to have the same degree of protection from environmental hazard as we can bring. And everybody has the local voices have to be involved in the solutions that are going to work for their communities. So that I think that we're understanding more about that. I actually think this next generation is helping us, is sort of forcing everybody to open their eyes and really revealing a lot of the injustices. I think we have better technology that allows us to measure what has otherwise been invisible: methane, air pollution, a lot of water pollution, those kinds of problems that we can now go into cities and point out exactly where the pockets of air pollution are. There's no surprise, it's in these communities that are poor and disenfranchised, often people of color. And it's impossible that we no longer focus on exactly those places and exactly those communities and work with them to figure out the solutions. I think that is part of the environmentalism of the 21st century.
Spectacular. Thank you. Thank you, Doria. So I'll stick with this for just a few moments. And Julian in particular, I mean, you and I and a couple other folks here, we work for well-known large research universities. And Emlyn, of course, works with museums, and we have other folks with CEOs, with businesses and nonprofits. So we, as a group, we span a large number of sectors. So Julian, I really want to know what you think responsibilities of universities in your case. What are our responsibilities towards environmental stewardship and addressing some of these issues of justice? How do we bring knowledge to the community, and in your case, the Baltimore community, which has a whole history of injustice issues? What can we do to enhance aspects of university research or teaching or service so that we can have a more positive impact in solving what Doria eloquently states as one of the foremost issues of the 21st century environmental movement?
Well, I'm looking at the clock here, and I have a million things I want to say, and not all the time to do it, but I'll say this. So, the higher education sector is doing exciting work that, is helping to catalyze through its sector and through training a generation, multiple generations of students to go out into the world and to make an impact on a constant basis. I think in some ways, for those of us that work behind the scenes at universities or are members of university communities, there's a trap of the fact that we see the global impact and reputation of our organizations. And so we assume that because our reach is tremendous through teaching and research and knowledge outcomes, that we should be able to translate that to environmental stewardship at our operational level in a seamless and ambitious way. And there are countless ways that we need to drive efficiency and resource consumption and waste reduction and equity. At the same time, it is very complicated, and it does require us to challenge ourselves. And so you have, these arms of universities, and many that are, the mission of Johns Hopkins to produce knowledge and to impact the world. When we juxtapose that, let's say, with an organization that's producing goods and services, it's sometimes a little easier to integrate sustainability and resource efficiency into supply chain choices and into top-down, production of goods and services than it is into, alignment of operational practices with knowledge outcomes. And so I actually think that we have, this sector has both the potential for grand outcomes, but they're very complex and multifaceted. So, when we think about Johns Hopkins, the largest private employer in the state of Maryland, a huge landowner, and it has a huge economic impact on the Baltimore area. I often like to tell people and students when I lecture in classes, because I think most people here don't realize just how big we truly are as an organization. We own around, let's say, 15 million square feet of space and 1,000 acres. We have $1 billion supply chain impact. We're a huge corporation. And so in some ways, the way we traditionally think about universities as academic engines is too simplified. We have to also think of ourselves as corporations that need to think about environmental stewardship deeply through our operational practices, recognizing the decentralized nature of our decision-making as organizations.
Yeah, Julian, I think that's a really interesting, important example to think about, as well as, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, is a NGO. We're a multidisciplinary society, so we have scientists from around the world. And I think that's one of the things we really try to harness and use the power of knowledge and bringing people together. So making sure that folks who come from different disciplinary backgrounds understand how to work together and come together to solve these big problems, because it's not just a biologist or a climatologist, right? Like, we need chemists, we need engineers, we need social scientists all coming together to talk, to understand different perspectives, to really advance some of these solutions that I think a lot of the NGO community is trying to support and act as bridges among different organizations and institutions. AAAS also tries to work really closely with industry to bring that perspective to help understand where we can improve different aspects of industry and make advancements in sustainability, pollution prevention, protection, to make the reality that we're humans and we're going to be using resources, we can use them in the most sustainable, reasonable way.
I'd like to suggest that another wrench in the works is with all due respect to my colleagues on the panel, and I realize we represent different sectors, as you're pointing out, Jerry, but it has been written recently that one of our problems is the extensive sort of siloing, the compartmentalization of our intellectual efforts. That, universities and the makeup of society, we lean towards departments and colleges. The real issues that we face are at the boundaries of those departments and those colleges. And that if we live within these silos, other than things like today, Earth Day, where we've got this great variety of interests and disciplines on the screen, but in general, that's not the situation. We're living in parts, not the whole. And I think we've got to sort of break ourselves out of this paradigm and start to embrace the more holistic, unifying approach to knowledge. I'll give you one example. I've always been so impressed with a university in Costa Rica, which is only and entirely about agriculture in the subtropical zone. That's all it does. And its entire focus is that. And I think rather than trying to be encyclopedic and having a bit of this and a bit of that, we'd be better off if we focused on the overarching things that we need to really focus on, that rely on bridge building between disciplines.
I would like to second that for a second because it's very close to my heart. I am in engineering by training, and nobody told me when I was in school, about climate change. Nobody. I ended up learning climate change years and years after practice. And that is happening in the disciplines. I totally agree with that perhaps we create the problems. There is this Dr. Orr, you heard about him. He writes about the education ecology. And he writes about that the destruction of the planet is not the poor people, it's not the ignorant. The destruction of the planet are PhDs, are engineers, are doctors, are very smart people that design those plastics that ended up in the oceans. They are not created by the poor people. I grew up in South America, and we used to tie things with plantain leaves, with natural things that are totally compostable. It was smart people that ended up developing plastics. So all these plastics in the oceans are developed by PhDs. So, and then he questions about that. And I go back exactly what Dr. Koster said. It was that we never learned how our actions are going to impact others. I think that is changing. I see that changing. My students are from all kinds of disciplines, and I love to see that. I love to see economists, engineers. I love to see public policy experts. I love to see all that multidisciplinary aspect. And one of the things that I do when I divided my teams in my classes is to try to include one person from different discipline, from different background, from different ethnology, from different sex, in order to have that multidisciplinary aspect that it can bring good ideas. One of the things that I love about the Biden's cabinet is how diversity is, because that diversity creates enormous knowledge, and that diversity is not just about the color of the skin or sexuality, but it's also about disciplines. And having combined those disciplines, I think we can enrich ourselves. So I totally 100% agree with you.
A lot of times when we have the various issues that we're talking about, it can I don't know, build up a certain amount of angst, right? Which Greta is very good at explaining when she's talking about climate change, right? And so every year, it seems to me that Earth Day offers this opportunity for us to reflect on how we can improve our personal relationship with the environment, how our business can change, whether it's through personal or kind of civic sustainable actions. And so I wonder, Sarah in particular, I wonder what your thoughts are on civic action and maybe some of the mental stresses that are accumulating in especially the younger generation as they feel the impending weight of climate change kind of mounting on them as it accumulates over time, over a perceived kind of lack of action by other generations. Can you make some comments on these mental stresses that are accumulating over impending environmental change?
Yes, thanks, Jerry. I would say that it's sort of a double-edged sword when we introduce the really detailed environmental and climate education into schools at a young age, which is so necessary to train the next generation of scientists and activists and community leadership, and just to build basic awareness, starting with something so simple as the water cycle. But as students become more aware of their natural world, their communities, the challenges of climate change, they also become aware of the incredible burdens and hurdles that they face. And I think they can become very frustrated and frankly, be overwhelmed. And I don't blame them. That is a huge, huge burden to place on young people. And we have seen, young people across this country and around the world express that. And at the same time, they have said this is part of what drives them to walk out of schools, to create these incredible, interdisciplinary movements. But I think it's something that we cannot forget, that at the same time they are being inspired, they are also suffering mental health impacts. And that when we talk about the climate, when we talk about environmental pollution, there are those who are, on the one hand, trying to push the ball forward, and with the other, living with these impacts on a daily basis. And so I would say that, when we're talking about these difficulties, these challenges, we have to realize that, we need to support these students, not just by showing up to marches, but by also ensuring that they have the structural support within their places of education, within their homes, within their communities, to empower them to speak out, but also to be reflective and, to make sure that their mental health, their physical well-being is taken care of as well.
Yeah, thank you. Well said. We only have a couple of minutes before we turn to question and answer, but I want to jump back to Doria for just a second. Doria's worked a lot in terms of conservation, and so there's numerous reports out there, and there's one in the Washington Post today that talks about the ability that maybe one of our saviors is not technology, but it's the ability to allow Earth's ecosystems to function properly. For example, giant kelp forests are among the best organisms on the planet for sequestering greenhouse gases. So my question, Doria, and it might seem too simple, but I wonder, in an area where we're investing so much time in climate change and technology to solve the hole that we're digging for ourselves, are we forgetting, or are we focusing enough on basic conservation of communities and ecosystems, which goes back to the injustice for the people who live in these ecosystems and communities that are degrading?
Well, it's interesting because, I've spent my life really trying to promote conservation of natural habitats, conservation of species. And now we have a brand new tool, which might be, it's not really so new. It's a couple decades old, at least in the tropics. But, thinking about carbon storage in these systems, and that undisturbed natural systems are much more effective holders of the carbon that's already there and continual stores of the carbon than if we are trying to rebuild these systems. So I'm working now, Dr. DeRosa said it in the introduction, I'm thinking a lot about carbon storage in natural systems, and I think that's tremendously important. We are going to need about 30% of the mitigation to happen in the short term through negative emissions into natural systems. So what are called nature-based climate solutions. I'm looking at agricultural soils, which are in fact the least obvious. So tropical forests, temperate forests, where we have huge biomass and also have great stores in places where we haven't already degraded those areas, are fantastic solutions for the climate. But additionally, they come with every co-benefit we ever wanted, right? For conservation purposes, for aesthetic purposes, for water quality and for air quality purposes. So we are, you know, these systems still are providing habitat for the world's creatures. And we are, as Emlyn pointed out, we are in the, you know, a huge extinction event that is caused by human change to the environment. But these natural areas are supporting remarkable numbers of species, and remarkable numbers of species are still there even when you think they can't be anymore. So nature is tenacious, and nature will recover long after we have cooked the world and changed our culture and changed everything about the system. We will have not the same species and certainly not in the same places, but we will have natural systems. But right now the natural systems are filtering contaminants out of water and providing clean drinking water if we let them. They are providing us with oxygen, obviously, through just basic functions, purifying air as those gases move through the great engineers that plants and animals are in the natural system. So I think I'm sort of optimistic in an odd way that a focus on, for example, storing carbon, which we need to do in these natural systems, will in fact bring promise for a lot of the other conservation values. And we see the Biden administration signing on to the global 30 by 30, protecting 30% of the lands and waters by 2030. That's significantly more than we've protected since the turn of the century, when I told you Teddy Roosevelt had really initiated a lot of that work. We see other countries making those same moves. These will not be the same systems. They're not in the same condition. We are stressing them from all directions. But in fact, it's optimistic that we still have the ability to be thinking about and working with nature, essentially, to help us recover from the ills we have wrought.
So on that, you just said a couple of really nice things, and I really like the idea you talk about how tenacious nature is. And I think you used the word transformational as well. And it strikes me that if we get anywhere near some of the promises that the current administration is making about climate change and CO2 and fossil fuels, that we're going to see really transformational changes all across our society in a whole variety of sectors. Should we be optimistic at this moment? And that's a question to everyone.
Gary, if I may jump in, I would just say that I'm very optimistic in how my generation has particularly taken in hand the power of consumer advocacy and their ability to dictate terms, sustainability goals, production, what have you. I'm thinking, you know, everything from where we source our food to how our clothes are made. There's started to be a real hand in the buyer, the consumer, taking note and saying, no, we do not accept the status quo. We have higher expectations of you know, our producers. So I would say in that regard, I think there's great hope, and that there is a desire to balance conservation, equity, sustainability with quality, ease of access, and a desire to figure out how to innovate in that space, how to you know, source local, whatever it might be.
I just want to second that. Obviously, I mentioned before that my students give me the hope that I need to keep this fight. I want to mention that we have to be optimistic, but we have to be also conscious that the challenges are enormous, and the impact on the environment is huge. The issue of equity is absolutely important. If there is something that we learned from the pandemic, is that the people in the low chain bottom of the economy are the ones that are gonna help us to survive. You know, the person who delivered the package or they clean the streets, they are the ones we need them. We need them as we need big executives or PhDs. We need them. And then I think we need to learn from that. I think we're gonna learn a lot from this pandemic. Some people call it like a call of nature to show humans that we are not super powerful, that a virus that we cannot see can basically destroy us. So I think we need to learn from that. I think we need to be humble, but we have to be optimistic because it's the only way that we can just move forward. Otherwise, we're just going to sit down and see the planet being destroyed, and that is something that I refuse to accept. We all have to move as a humanity with optimism, but again, never with complacence. We have to accept that the challenges are enormous, but we have to have that disposition that change is possible. It doesn't matter how you call it, change is possible.
I'd like to sort of come in on the needed balance, building on what was just said, the balance between humility and pragmatism. You know, that one of the terms we haven't mentioned so far is the tipping point phenomenon. You know, that one of the big anxieties in the scientific community is that we just may not be aware when a given major variable in nature tips to a new and more serious in a very short amount of time. And one example of that right now is you may have heard about it, the Antarctica area is being watched very closely, monitored for the situation affecting the Thwaites Glacier, which is widely considered to contain the equivalent of a 3-foot rise in global sea level. A 3-foot rise of global sea level in one glacier, which if it melts will have that effect. So I would be more optimistic if I saw that cities around the world were beginning to actively plan for the incremental relocation to higher ground, not just inland, because it has to be higher than current sea level. You know, major cities are trying to act in a resilient way, and I follow New York and the New York metro area closely, but, you know, we can't take many more Sandies with its 12-foot overnight surge and high tide rise and believe that we can continue to sort of dry out as sea level is incrementally rising. So Miami knows this, Jakarta, Indonesia knows this, and so does Sacramento, and so do many other cities. But it's a lot easier just to try and keep on building higher walls or hoping it won't happen in our administration than actually taking the bold move to start to relocate, which is going to be required in at least 100 years by many cities.
I just want to build on this a little bit, and I think Emily's sobering points in a lot of areas are valuable, as well as some of the optimism that a lot of you have expressed. I think this is part of the challenge of the cognitive dissonance we sort of experience between the unending shining examples, you know, that we can point to that really embody positive outcomes that are helping us move forward at a rapid pace, with the countless examples on the counterbalance that make us sort of feel paralyzed in our ability to see progress and feel like we can reach the change we need to as a global society. And, you know, this is part of when we think about science communication and behavior change. I know this comes up a lot, which is there is an enormous amount of decision paralysis when we think about behavior change and action. You know, talking about the food you eat and the waste you dispose, a lot more challenging than thinking about climate change because of the massive interrelated issues. And so thinking about how we want to change behavior and bring specificity to action, I think is really critical here. So people don't get overwhelmed and organizations don't get overwhelmed, but we can create tangible strategies, goals, and metrics to measure our progress.
Yeah, outstanding. I'm supposed to be moderator, but I have to make at least one comment on the optimistic side. So I'm extremely optimistic, and I base that in part, I suppose, by the group of individuals I spend most of my time around, which are students. And I have to tell you, I am incredibly impressed every time I go into the classroom over the past few years specifically about the determination, the vision, and the deep thinking that seems to be required to get us out of the mess that we've dug ourselves into. So I'm putting my money on some of these younger folks, these students who are going to take us down a pathway that we need to go down. All right, I've already talked a little bit too long. We have a number of questions in the chat, and so I'd like to turn it over now to Dr. DeRosa to give voice to some of these questions.
Thank you, Jerry. So I am going to be the voice of the questions that have been asked in the chat. And just a reminder to our viewers, you can still keep posting questions and I will try and get to them. We do have a lot, so I may not be able to get to all of them, but I'll get to some of them. One of the questions that we had was for anyone on the panel. This panel is largely academic and nonprofit. Emlyn mentioned the siloing to be more effective in solving these wicked problems facing the planet, we need to strive to break down and work across these silos, and scientists working with social scientists, working with educators. What role do you see corporations and businesses serving in this effort?
So I can take a little bit of that because I'm coming from the private sector. I work in the big companies for many decades, and then I'm switching for the academia sector, but I still have a link with the businesses. So obviously we know about how the businesses are right now confronting with the issues of not only climate change and environmental issues, but also social issues. I live here in Atlanta, Georgia. You probably hear about these organizations that are calling for boycott, big companies that are not giving a presence in social issues. So I truly believe that companies see that they have a responsibility, especially the bigger the company, the more aware of those issues. We know that there are plenty of metrics that they have been created in order to be sure that they are not only good for the environment, but also good for social issues. Like for instance, the ESG metrics that probably you already, some of you are familiarized with that. So there is an enormous responsibility for the companies, but more so because consumers are being aware of the situation. The more the consumers are aware, the more the consumers are educated, the faster that the companies have the incentive to change the way that they are doing their systems. I truly believe that there is enormous movement in that direction. And also about like for instance, going back to the issue of climate change, right now companies realize that the investments in practices that are detrimental for climate change is not only a bad investment, but also the perception of the consumers, it can change the bottom line. So at the end, I truly believe that it maybe it's organic. At the same time, obviously, we need a little push from regulations, obviously. But between the push from regulations, like for instance, putting the price of carbon, I think somebody you mentioned the price of carbon, putting the price of carbon and the consumers, the pressure for the consumers, it will be organically that the private sector is going to be on board.
Can I jump into that as well? Because in the nonprofit arena, in the advocacy nonprofit arena, what we do is make partners, right? Across all sectors, from the research sector to the government sector to the corporate sector. And because it's only through building strong alliances that we actually make good progress, right? And EDF is an evidence-based advocacy organization, and our whole goal is to find solutions, right? Is to build progress, and a lot of those are based in policy. But the private sector I agree entirely that consumers, that the combination between consumers and the corporations can be very powerful. But these corporations are very savvy. They are looking further ahead often than governments are, certainly than individuals are, often than researchers are, because we're focused on individual questions. They have to project far out. They're thinking about the global economy now, because we are so globally linked across. And so many of these companies are showing great leadership in developing sustainability goals, in developing their own net zero targets, in moving forward. And this is not to say that everybody's doing it perfectly or even with the best motivations, but in fact, a lot are very well motivated and a lot are very effective. And I think that it's only in working in concert where, for example, an NGO can bring good science to a company, help advise on sustainability goals or net zero goals, and then look at the measurement of progress toward those goals, that we actually can make a lot of progress in collaboration with the private sector. And so, we are, my optimism notwithstanding, we are in a seriously urgent place. We just heard that Mauna Loa's observatory has recorded the highest amount of carbon that we've ever seen this month. And so, it's not reversing, it's not happening. Even COVID is not going to put a permanent down forcing on the slope of the line of greenhouse gases. We need every sector to come together. And I think the private sector is an incredibly important piece of that puzzle.
Thank you, Doria, sorry. I agree completely. They're a very important piece of that puzzle. it does seem that there's an enormous number of companies that are branding as their products as being eco-friendly. And I wonder, maybe Julian, you might be able to help with this question. Do you think that we need a little bit more accountability, though, with some of these companies that are branding their products as eco-friendly?
It's incredibly complicated for consumers who genuinely want to do the right thing. And we have a working group here at Johns Hopkins focused on sustainable procurement. And the topic of what sustainability means in supply chain and procurement in itself is really complex. When we think about the goods and services produced, are we talking about the distance that they travel? It's not easy for consumers to necessarily make these differentiations. A lot of labeling in areas of in food and products is not regulated in a way that makes it simple for us to understand. And so there is a tendency for people to to either be difficult on themselves or one another, in this term of climate guilt and the pressure that we put on ourselves or others, right, to sort of judge how green we are based on the legitimacy of our impact and what we purchase and produce and use. We do need to challenge, I think, these labels. I personally think this is where third-party verified labeling is really critical, right? Where science can inform how we don't let companies themselves determine whether something is fresh, natural, sustainable, but how we rely on the science to inform those externally vetted certifications. And you see that across both consumer goods sectors and others.
Thank you. Yes, I think that does help with the people that are purchasing these products and services, help them make wise decisions. We have a question now that kind of goes back to an earlier part of our conversation. It was mentioned that we need to do this, but how? How can the environmental movement do a better job of engaging Indigenous voices and local communities and communities of color and making sure that they have a seat at the table? And this question is for anyone on the panel that would like to start.
I'm happy to take the first stab at this question, and my answer will not be perfect, but I think there is always room for improvement. And I would say that it starts with how we train our scientists to think about what is good science and what are the answers that we're seeking, the questions that we're asking. And I would say for a very long time, scientists have been trained to be objective, and that's the only kind of sort of data that we would allow into our analyses or into our peer review, whatever it might be. And that there now needs to be this moment of reckoning for how we think about what science is and the data that becomes part of the analysis, and subjectivity, lived experience, citizen science, all of these things must become part of the equation. And I would say that there's this a model for how this can be done. It's called the community-based participatory model. And this is something that, I am myself working on in my day-to-day work as well. But ensuring that when you go into a community to try and answer your research question or your policy question, whatever it might be, that you're listening to those who have lived experience, who have been in that community, and that you are not just coming in to say, I know how to answer this question, I know how to do this research, and I will present you with an answer, and then you should go out and enact whatever solution I am presenting you with. This is incredibly disrespectful, and often you are exploiting these communities and these individuals who have lived in these circumstances for a long time, so simply so that scientists can publish a paper or whatever sort of goals they have set for themselves. So we want to ensure that when a scientist is making a connection with the community, that they are looking to that community leadership to answer questions that are relevant, that the community themselves have identified, and that you are not dictating to a community either the questions that should be asked or the solutions that will be implemented.
I think on this question, one of the tremendous areas of progress we might agree from the events of 2020 has been the very rapid, maybe unprecedented speed with which workplaces have become desiring to be and becoming more diverse. I think what needs to also happen is that it's in the rush to do this, to look like we're all doing our part in a very fractious society, as important as how people look is how people think. And looking into the expertise that people bring, whatever their ethno-racial background, is a sensitive matter. But I think, you know, we're not going to make the urgent progress that Doria just underscored that we must by simply looking at this issue cosmetically. It needs to be looked at so that, as I think Jairo said earlier, that diversity must breed not just a diversity of appearance and equality and equity and inclusion, but also as fast as possible, and we have so little time, a rich diversity of a unified approach to the issues, because we need to bring all of those thoughts to the table. And I think we need to spend more time in hiring, looking at what people think as well as how they look.
I want to also add that I work here for some communities of color here in Atlanta. You know, as a minority, we work a lot in climate change issues and how it affects low-income communities. And there is this huge organization here in Atlanta. It's amazing. It's called the Partnership for Southern Equity, and it works specifically in those kind of issues. And we have a conference yesterday. And then the director has something that it just stuck in my mind, is that it's not the issue to be on the table. They want to be on the table, but the issue is to have a voice on the table. It's not just to be there, but just have the voice. And then we're analyzing how they can get involved. And the best that they can get involved is through partnerships. It's partnerships with the scientific community, partnerships with policymakers. Through partnerships, those communities can leverage those acknowledge that definitely I completely agree with Sarah. We need to leverage. We use something that is called a asset-based development. The asset-based is just, instead of telling the people, this is your problem, this is how you're gonna fix the problem, is to leverage what are the potential, how they can contribute to their own solutions and leverage the potential that they have, because they do have a lot of knowledge that we are not catching. So the idea is, again, is not just to be on the table, is to have a voice on the table and to create the partnerships in order to be sure that the table, that voice is heard.
Thank you. I think that's absolutely essential. And I think all of the recommendations that you have made from the panel are spot on. One more question for our panel as we close out today. An overwhelming kind of theme and also interest among our community that's incredibly valuable is for climate and environmentalism and the environmental movement is communicating the need for action in addition to action. How do we, and this is an overwhelming question among our community, how do we get the word out, especially about these tipping points that Emlyn mentioned earlier? How do we make environmentalism a priority with the media, with engaging our community with activism and with our within our disciplines and across silos? How do we do that? So across our panel, what do you guys recommend?
I think the talk has to be different than it so often is. You know, we can easily say, and we can hear in the news and from policy people, you know, we're making a priority on tackling climate change. That is said far more often than how the given agency plans to do that, particularly when it's being said by one country and the atmosphere is shared by every country in the world. You know, I think we need there's so little time, and I worry that there's not enough time. And as Greta Thunberg says, you know, where are the leaders in the room? We've got to make progress yesterday in order to aggregate, synthesize, approach these issues in transdisciplinary ways that do bring the best of ideas to the fore and help to fill out statements of tackling climate change with what is it we're going to actually do and how and with whom and when.
So I think that as an anecdote, a few months ago, I was outside with my mask, and we had this, you know, distance with this person that was picking up the trash, and then it was very hot day. It was a very hot day during the winter, and then he told me, I didn't say that I was working on climate, and he told me that the day was too hot, that he couldn't believe that some people didn't believe in climate change. And to me, it was just like, you know about climate change. So I explained that I work in climate change, and we had this conversation. But I truly believe that is something that even the most remote person in the most remote part of the world can see. Climate change is something that we feel. Every person that is conscious about the weather, and we experience the weather almost every day. So I truly believe that is something that everybody is aware of. So the thing is, how we can get those people engaged is by giving them, first of all, obviously telling that we can fix this, and second of all, giving the ownership and empower them, and telling that this solution depends on all of us. And then making, we have to leave behind our scientific terminologies, because that we already know that. We already know about all the problems with the albedo, we know all about all that situation. We just need to communicate the message in a clear sense, that we can create jobs, we can make a better place for everybody, and we can address this problem. So we have to reduce use common language in order to transmit the message and empower the people to tell them that we all can make the difference, that the small things are important, and that never let anybody tell you, oh, no, that's not going to make the difference, because this is making the difference. So just empower the people that this is a problem that is affecting us all, but we all can have a say and actions that we can take to address this issue.
I mean, if you look at where we are now and our federal government's announcement today and the prioritization of climate is a direct result of the communication of people in the streets literally clamoring and screaming and forcing our government to take climate and environmental action seriously and urgently. And we would not be where we are today if it weren't for those social movements and the critical communication that comes from advocacy. And so it's fascinating when we think about the role of science, the role of practitioner, the role of advocacy, and the voice that we all have, and how those can really come together. But when I reflect on some of the announcements from today and just how drastically the climate action and environmental action has changed in the past 3 months under a new administration here in the United States, I look squarely to the streets, and I look to all the people who are continue to pressure our governmental administrators at the local and national level to really embed this, at all levels. And so let's hope for a brighter future. I think that's all we can do.
Thank you. Yes, it is promising to see that social movements do work if you keep people burning with their enthusiasm and you get them out in the streets protesting, and you keep that enthusiasm and activism up. So it is an exciting day. On behalf of Jerry and the entire panel, I would like to thank everyone for joining us today, and have a wonderful Earth Day. Thank you very much.